All right. Hello, Internet. So this is Charleston with the Upper Skagit Library, and I am here with my friend Jeanette. And I think she probably wouldn't be too upset with me if I describe her as a geek.
Just a little
uh,
bit.
just a little bit. We met years and years ago virtually, so this is one of my very best friends in the world, but I have not actually met her physically, so bless the internet for bringing her into my life. But we used to geek out about things years and years back that, it brought so much joy to my life, because Jeanette is this person who can look at a story and tell you what it means, even beyond the surface level, and tell you why it's either good storytelling or bad storytelling. And she will absolutely convince you. Like, if you started off with one opinion and then you actually listen to some of her theories and her thoughts on a story, you're gonna go, whoa. And so I spent many years just being in awe
Jeez.
of that ability, and I believe firmly that it comes from her experience with the topic that we are talking about today. So as you all know, I am a fan of horror, and I'm happy to have a friend that has a passion that is alongside that interest. So Miss Jeanette is somebody who is, I call her a Poe scholar, and I'm hoping that's the right description, but I was hoping maybe you could kind of tell us about, properly what your history with Poe is. Edgar Allan Poe, for those that, are not on a first name or last name basis like we are with him.
Well, he liked to be called Eddie, so we could call him that.
Oh, and I'm never calling him anything else. Eddie, that is so cute.
It's very sweet. He was kind of a little more folksy than you'd expect, and we'll get into that. But yes, I have spent quite a long time studying Poe as a secondary research interest. I normally lived in the 14th century with Chaucer and a guy named William Langland and all those really old poets. But Poe is something special, and he just sort of gives me life. I love his story. I love how unusual it is in ways you wouldn't expect, because we all have a kind of idea that we know who he is. You know, let me ask you,
He's
Chaslin.
the spooky guy that, quoth the raven nevermore. That's, in pop
Yeah.
culture, that's what we know. He's kind of somber, and he's taking people's hearts and burying them under the floorboards, and stuff
Mm,
like that, right? So that's what we think of him
yeah.
as.
We think of him like that, and we kind of love him too, I think.
Oh,
It's
I
sort
love
of
him for it dearly. I mean, there are times I'm like, I'm going to take somebody's heart and bury it under the floorboards.
someone we've really embraced into our culture, and that he has that place where he's the dark, somber genius, but there's so much more
The
to
tortured
know.
artist kind of trope.
Yes. Yes, so I have some notes prepared, and I'm going to ask you a lot of questions, and we're just going to chat about them.
I
But
love it.
first, yes, first we have three pictures of Poe, and I think they kind of tell a story, each
Okay.
taken a year in succession. So let's start with the first one in 1846. This is a
Okay, we're gonna
watercolor
screen
painting.
share, and here's where we're going with that.
Hmm,
Okay,
need a
and bear
picture.
with me as Zoom moved on me, which is so rude. Okay, can you see that?
Yeah, I can see that.
Perfect. Okay,
Right.
and
What can you
I
tell me about this? You just look at this guy. Who
look
is
at
this
that
guy?
handsome devil.
Yeah, he had a girlfriend, Sarah Royster, who kept referring to him as a beautiful boy.
Oh. I mean, I wouldn't describe him as a boy here. He's got those
He's a little
defined,
more.
that jawline, that hair is very
Mm,
nicely kept. His nose, it looks a little bright, like he's been out in the cold.
right. And these paintings, I mean, it's going to be a little idealized, which is why I put up the second one, so you can get a sort of a sense of what he looked like in a photograph, a daguerreotype.
Mm.
But you see, he has the big eyes, big gray eyes. He has the hair. They liked a kind of big head back then. It was the idea that made you smart.
Oh, hey, well, there
He
we
actually
go.
he actually joked about that sometimes because phrenology was still a thing, and he kind of had this big head, and he said, "People love my head." All right,
That's adorable.
let's see that second picture because you'll kind of see it's the same guy.
Okay.
This is
So let's,
1847.
and then, so 1847, and let me make sure, oops, let's see, if I select the right one. Bear with us, folks, I'm still learning
It's
Zoom.
okay. This is the daily daguerreotype. They all have names.
Okay, let's see. If I click on this one and then I switch the photo, maybe that'll work.
Yes,
Because
the
it
one in
kept
the
showing me the
middle.
third one. There we go. We
Yep,
got it.
there you go. And he now has his mustache. He only had it for the last couple years of his life, but you always think of him having one. But you can see
Right.
it's the same guy, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I mean, this is a photo as opposed to a painting as the first one,
Hmm.
right? So, I mean, you could definitely tell that. And it kind of erases some of his features because of the way photography was back then.
Yeah,
But you
they
could
didn't have
still
the best
see.
detail.
Yeah, exactly. But you could tell he's a tiny bit older. His hairline's maybe receded a little bit. But the
Yeah,
eyes are the same. He still looks incredibly put together. You
and he's
know.
really relaxed. He's leaning back.
He
I
looks
get a
like he's
sense
waiting for
of,
a friend.
yeah, and there's a sweet story behind this picture. A friend of Poe's had a teenage daughter who just loved his writing. She's like, "Oh, the Raven. Oh, it's so romantic. I want to meet him." And he brought her to see him. And she was so happy. It was like meeting a rock star. And she asked for a picture. So he actually had this taken for her and let her keep it.
Oh, that's adorable.
Isn't it?
So then that begs the question then. So at that point, was Poe seen as a romance author as opposed to perhaps like a gothic horror author? Like,
Well, there's
because
a
when I think
lot of
of the Raven,
overlap.
it's like it's scary, but the way oh, it's so romantic, it's not quite how we think of it today.
Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying, and I think you're right. It's all about the lost love and being devoted to one special person who understands you, and you have this deep connection, sort of that surpasses time and death, and is always there. And just, that's a recurring theme in his writing. In his personal life, he got along well with women and related to them comfortably. And I think, well, in his stories, they tend to be sort of an object of angst or loss. You still see that he feels this emotional connection there.
Mm.
And I think,
It's not
yeah.
not lost from a selfish perspective. It's because he valued them so much. It
Mm,
wasn't just, oh, it's all about me. It's these were amazing people, amazing women, and the
yeah.
world is worse off without them.
An appreciation. And you see that in the response to The Raven. A lot of teenage girls loved it. Women responded well to it. It was it was romantic
Mhm.
as well as
It's not
scary.
just the goth kid, that I was in my high school days,
Yeah.
where it's like, oh, that's so spooky, it's or the with the candles and yeah, the
Hmm.
stereotypical image of the goth kid. It was the normal everyday teenage girl who
Yes.
saw a man basically thinking of a woman with such love and respect,
Hmm.
and was able to write about it.
You can sort of imagine the Twilight crowd or something like that. I mean,
Yeah.
that might be a little dated at this point, but the idea
It's
of being
relevant
special,
again.
like supernatural romances often do that, where, the woman is special to the male character in some way that transcends some supernatural impediments. So you see that
Hmm.
repeating and repeating in
I love
writing, and
it.
people respond to it.
Right, absolutely.
All right,
Okay.
so let's go to number three. So we got 1846, 1847. How about 1848?
All right.
One
And
year
I
later.
believe 1 year. Okay. So this to me looks like a very different man. I mean,
Hmm.
you could still see the I mean, the facial structure in the photo has improved because you could definitely see the details. but
Yes.
he's holding himself very differently.
He's kind of slumped, isn't he?
He
Like
looks
he's
very
sort of
stiff and uncomfortable.
dropped in a chair. How about his
Hmm.
face? What do you think of that?
He does not look pleased. If he was looking at me like that, I would be like, "Oh no, what did I do? I'm so sorry."
Mm, he's he's having a rough time. This
It looks like
photo,
it.
this photo was taken on one of the worst days of his life. And have you seen it before? Do you recognize it?
This, I mean, when you see Poe merchandise, because Poe has is that level where he has merchandise,
Hmm.
we've got T-shirts, we've got fan art, we've got people make bookmarks out of him. There's a company, they make these bookmarks that are kind of like 3D bookmarks partially,
Hmm.
where they'll put like a head and feet on things, or if it's an animal, they'll put like little tails and stuff. And they have a Poe bookmark of this, and
Oh,
they
that's
have
awesome.
this face, and then they put like the nice slacks and shoes on the other end. But this
Hmm.
is this is the face that they translated to the 3D portion of the bookmark.
Right. And like you'll see other pictures of Poe, but I think the majority of the time you see this one.
Yeah, absolutely.
And like just around me right now, I have some stuff I gathered from my house that has this image on it. Because,
Oh, I have to
why wouldn't I
see.
collect this?
We
All
have
right.
to do a show and tell here.
Show and tell time. All right. Well, first, my husband gave me these enamel pins. So
Wow.
you
And
have
I'm
the
a sucker for
raven.
pens, so I love this. This
Yes,
is
I love them
great.
too. You can put them on your bag, you can put them on your coat. It's great.
So
It's
wait,
fun.
the Unemployed Philosophers Guild. That's hilarious.
Hmm. They have a bunch of these things. They're fun. Look them up.
Okay.
And geek culture is alive now. It's great. You can get anything. So there's the picture.
Yeah, I mean it very much looks, gosh, so I mean in the photo itself he does look a little bit annoyed, but in the
Mhm.
pin he looks tired too, even more
Yeah,
so.
even more so. And like they're sort of picking up on that. It's like the Raven is a character in his
Mhm.
stories, but it's almost like Poe is a character, you know?
He's become a caricature of himself.
Yes, a caricature and a character. It
Yeah.
goes together. And so like I have a mug with the same image.
Right.
Again, it's like a cartoon, literally, of that drawing or that
Right.
photograph. And like I always joke about this and show it to everyone. This is my Edgar Allan pillow. So he keeps me company in my
No,
little reading nook here.
I'm gonna out you here as a little bit, because when I first discovered your love of Poe, I believe you didn't even say his name outright. You were writing about something and you were tying it to Poe, and you
Mhm.
said my dead boyfriend, and I had to go, wait, who is your dead boyfriend? And you were like, it's Poe, and then you sent me a picture of that pillow, I believe, or something similar,
Yes,
and I
something
went,
like
I'm
that.
so glad I am friends with this person.
So yeah,
But
yeah,
it's
he's been
it's
known as my
so
dead boyfriend for a while.
and I'm sure your husband doesn't mind. There's
Oh
room
no,
in
I
your
think he
heart for
might have
both
been
of
the one to
them.
come up with that.
But it's so fascinating to me because, there's love and affection for this man who is an incredible artist, but we also have decided to take the picture from what you said was the most horrible day of his life and turn that into what we think represents him. But looking at those
Yes.
other photos, I mean, that's drastically different. I mean, he called himself Eddie. Like, he wanted his friends to call him Eddie,
Eddie,
not
yeah.
Poe. I think of, Poe as, like, I don't know if you've seen the most recent Star Wars movies, but the Kylo Ren character, like
Oh
that, like
yeah.
he's so serious, and he wants to be respected, and that's kind of like what a Poe evokes,
Sort
from
of a
our
teenage
perspective.
angsty kind of
Yeah,
edginess.
like when young teens are trying to be cool, they're gonna start reading Poe. They're gonna start, I don't know, reading Fight Club and watching Fight Club, and they think they're edgy and they're cool for it. And it's not to make fun of them, and that's not to make fun of, the artists themselves, because they're absolutely fabulous. but it's just we've taken these preconceived notions of these people, and then we've monetized it, and at the same time that we're paying homage to them, we're paying homage to them on like the worst day of their life.
Let me tell you the story about that, because it sort of
Please.
shows how we're reducing him almost to like one moment and making
Hmm.
that who he is. And there's so much more we can enjoy. So let's find out why that happened and how that happened.
Fabulous.
So this daguerreotype's name, they all seem to have names, is the Ultima Thule portrait. And that is very evocative. It's Latin, it means the outermost extremity,
Interesting.
the edge of everything, you know, just the last bit. In drawings on maps, they'd often describe that as the edge of the earth where you'd topple over. So, like, he's at his last straw there, and this is the story. He'd been engaged to a woman, Sarah and Helen Whitman, who was a transcendental poet he worked with and who was one
Hmm.
of his contemporaries. You can still see her popping up in American literature anthologies. I mean, she's an important poet in her own right. He had lost his wife before this and had sort of given up in a lot of ways at the time. It was really hard for him. He was struggling. He was trying to find a way to continue his career and to continue in his personal life. And he met her and they connected and developed a relationship. They became engaged and it all fell apart.
Hmm.
He was in Rhode Island with her. They had some bad experiences. Her mother told her that she didn't want this guy around. He's sort of emotionally erratic. He has trouble. Um, so this future he saw himself having was gone. He was ill. He'd had repeated problems with severe headaches, with some cognitive problems, confusion. After his wife died, he was bedridden for a couple months with his own illness, which came
Wow.
and went throughout his life. One of his neighbors was a nurse, Marie Shu, and she theorized that he had a brain lesion. Um,
Ooh.
if you looked back at the pictures we looked at before, you would notice that one side of his face is starting to droop over time,
Interesting.
which
So
might
let's
suggest something going on there.
so we'll go back to that second photo.
Right. If you go from the second to the third, you can see how his face is changing. And you know, it's
Interesting.
hard to guess with stuff like this because, you know, it's the past. They couldn't really do any real scanning of people's brains, but it could explain it.
Huh. So he was basically chronically ill.
Yes. And so
And
he'd
then,
lost hope for the future. He was ill. He was alone. He had no prospects. He'd think, this is it. I'm done. And he tried to kill himself.
oh.
Yes, he had a suicide attempt, which didn't work. He tried to take laudanum, which people used for sleep.
Mm.
But he was not accustomed to taking drugs and he couldn't take enough. He passed out before he could actually kill himself that way.
Oh, wow.
So he's in this hotel in Rhode Island, stoned out of his gourd, very sick, heartbroken, hopeless, and alone. And this guy shows up. We only know is his name was McFarlane. And it's like, who is he? We don't know.
Right, just this
A
random
guy
guy.
who decided to sort of look after him and take care of him. And we don't know, was he a guest in the hotel? Was he just some friend of a friend? You know,
Or just some
somehow,
good Samaritan, maybe?
yeah. And he sort of looked after him and made sure he was okay.
Hmm.
But one thing we know he did is in the morning, after nursing him all night, dragged him off to a daguerreotypist, plopped him in a chair, and had that picture taken.
Oh, interesting. So it was more if I keep this guy alive, it benefits me in a way.
Yes,
Hmm.
because you could get kickbacks if you had a celebrity brought to a daguerreotypist. Because, you know, getting pictures was hard back then, and it would raise the profile of a daguerreotypist to have celebrity photographs, and also you could sell them.
Huh. So
So,
so Poe is already well established and published and well known. So I mean there are some authors where they really weren't well known
mhm,
until after they had passed away, but Poe was not one of them. He knew
no.
that people were enjoying his works at the very least.
Yes, he was well known. He had written The Raven before this, which really catapulted him into fame. And it was in an odd position, which we'll talk about in a little bit, where he was very famous, but he couldn't make a living. And
Mm.
we'll explain why that is. So what we're seeing here is this one image in this one moment in his life. And I think a lot of people have moments like this. People struggle with mental health. I mean,
Mm.
people even sadly, I mean, it's common to have suicide attempts. It's not the entirety of a life, but he's a cartoon now. He's the cartoon of my mug of that
Right.
guy.
We see drawings of Poe and Lovecraft together because they're considered these forefathers of the genre,
Yes, they
and
are.
it's they're jokes usually these fan arts, you know.
Mhm.
It's interesting, and it's all based off this what I mean, like I'm just sitting here trying to imagine like a day where I wake up and then nothing goes right, and these horrible things happen, and then that's my legacy, like, and it was just one random day where I woke up grumpy,
Mhm.
and there we go. Like that's it, that's who Chaslin was. I mean,
Mhm.
that's essentially what happened to him, and I can imagine, if social media were a thing, would that be his legacy? Because, maybe he could take back control of his image. But at that time, you couldn't really take back control of your image. Your image was what others made of it at
He
times.
also died in 1849. So he was not around. And that leads me to my next point. Sort of, how did this image of Poe solidify? What happened? He was dead. He couldn't tell people who he was anymore.
Now, did he
And
have family members to advocate for him, or?
Sarah Helen Whitman, the ex-fiance, did. But she
Okay.
wasn't listened to very much, in part because she was a woman, and in part because her version of who he was kind of boring.
Got you. It wasn't the drama
It,
that everyone so
this
wanted
is
it to
drama.
be.
And there was a guy, a particular guy, who wanted to tell that story about the drama and make Poe this larger than life figure. And his name was Rufus Griswold.
Hmm.
Now, that's quite a name, Rufus
It,
Griswold.
it is.
Griswold, it's fun to say. Uh, but he was one of Poe's literary rivals in life. They were
Oh.
competing for jobs. They had some personal scuffles where Poe reviewed a work of Griswold's, and Griswold felt like he wasn't effusive enough about how good it was.
Oh.
Yeah, Poe, it was normal when people wrote a review at the time to send them an honorarium just to pay for their time in printing. And Poe was like, "Did you consider that a bribe? Because I was just trying to give a good review." And it was a good review. It was like he
Right.
just said, "I think you may have spent too much time talking about New England writers in this work. It was about writers of America. You might want to next time sort of include more people from the South, etc., sort
He
of
was
make it
trying to
all
do
one thing."
constructive criticism rather than just blow smoke, kind of thing.
Right. And it seems like that wasn't enough. But they were competing already at that point, so I think Griswold maybe took it personally because they were already kind of like frenemies.
So
And
kind of like
like,
a Hamilton Burr kind of situation.
yes. And so there was this tension, and they had some back and forths, and sometimes they got along and sometimes they didn't. But then Poe dies.
Mm.
Suddenly, this obituary starts popping up in the newspapers all over the country, circulating under a pseudonym. And it was Griswold, but he didn't
Mm.
put his name on it. And the first line, let me read you the first line. Edgar Allan Poe is dead. He died the day before yesterday. This announcement will startle many, but few will be grieved by it.
Ooh, that's
Burn.
savage.
And then
Yeah.
he starts saying he had no friends. He was this crazy person who drove everyone away, and he was like an addict, and he was just awful, and just creating this idea of him being this dark genius that couldn't live in the world, and on, just sort of that, like the Ultima Thule picture. is a moment in a life, not a whole life. Sarah
So,
Helen Whitman, the ex-fiance, wrote Griswold immediately and said, I know that was you.
oh, so that's how we know, because she knew. Oh
She knew the
gosh.
minute she saw it. And she started to defend Poe, but again, her version of Poe was boring, and his
Right.
version was wild. Can I read you a passage that Griswold wrote about Poe later?
Yeah, absolutely. Did he change his mind even a little, or did he make it worse?
He made it worse.
Oh no.
He actually forged letters to prove some of his points about Poe being like this dissipated, dark person, just wrapped up in this sort of destructive behavior. Let me read what he said about Poe and see if it sort of speaks to the art and pop culture image we have of him.
Hmm.
He was at all times a dreamer, dwelling in ideal realms in heaven or hell, peopled with the creatures and accidents of his brain. He walked the streets in madness or melancholy, with lips moving in indistinct curses, or with eyes upturned in passionate prayer, never for himself, for he felt or professed to feel that he was already damned, but for the happiness who at the moment were objects of his idolatry, or with his glances introverted to a heart gnawed with anguish and with a face shrouded in gloom, he would brave the wildest storms, and all night, with drenched garments and arms beating the winds and rains, would speak as if to spirits that at such times only could be evoked by him from Eden, close by whose portals his disturbed soul sought to forget the ills to which his constitution subjected him, close by the Eden where were those he loved, the Eden which he might never see, but in fitful glimpses at its gates open to receive the less fiery and more happy natures whose destiny to sin did not involve the doom of death.
Wow. So credit where credit's due. He wasn't a horrible writer, because that is
Gets
some
your attention.
imagery. Yeah, it
Is that
definitely
a
does.
real person though?
No, it's I okay, I'm gonna go way off the reservation here. Um there I don't My patrons may not be familiar with the concept of creepypasta, but basically it's on the internet, people write creepy stories, and it's a whole genres thing. If we want to talk about that in a future Geek Group video, I am all way too happy to talk about it, because it's a fascinating phenomenon. But basically, as you were reading that, I was imagining one called suicidemouse.avi, where it's Mickey Mouse walking with his head down like this, and he's fighting his way against like a gale of wind that's blowing him back, and he's
Mm-hmm.
grunting and growling and melting. Like I mean, I won't go totally into that creepypasta, but that's kind of the image I have of like Poe as a cartoon fighting his way against a gale of wind, and there's like eyes blinking in the background and owls and maybe little skeletons dancing.
Mm,
Like it's just,
spoopy.
yeah. Right, like hashtag spoopy or too spooky for me, where it's like the writing itself is serious, and it evokes such imagery, but thinking back on it now, like I'm wondering, was he just on his way to the grocery store on a bad day? Like, was he on his way to the pharmacy to get some laudanum? Like, just like, what would drive Griswold to just describe a walk in such a way?
It's like he's turning Poe into a character in Poe's stories, isn't
Mm,
he? It's like Poe
yeah.
has become his stories. And I'll get to why that doesn't quite work for the way Poe wrote in a little bit. But first, let me tell you a little about Poe that kind of rubs against this image.
Mm.
All right? Well, first, we said he liked to go by Eddie. That
Yeah.
does not have the gravitas of someone beating his arms against the storm.
If we're going gothic and we're going Eddie, I'm thinking of adorable, like Eddie from the Munsters, like it's cutesy scary, not like actually scary.
So he was an athlete. He loved to swim. He'd swim in the Hudson River outside his house in Fordham, which
Sure.
is now the Bronx. Yeah, cold. I wouldn't swim in the Hudson now, though. Ugh. So he ran, he boxed, he was an avid swimmer, he did the long jump in school.
He was a
I think
jock.
his kind of, yeah. He sang, he played the flute, he enjoyed music. As a newspaperman, he reviewed a lot of musical shows and
Mm.
was able to sort of understand how they came together and what was going on with them because of that background. He loved to garden, he kept songbirds in cages on his porch. Took hikes. One thing I really love is how when he was young in school, he was in Virginia and he would hike in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and he didn't have a dog, so he would borrow people's dogs to walk
Oh,
in the mountains.
I'm just gonna walk your dog. Is that okay?
Mm.
Okay, I'm taking your dog now. I'll bring it back later, maybe.
He loved bad puns. He had a cat
Oh,
named Katerina. It's terrible. He loved coffee. One
word.
time he said he was a his last name is Poe because he's a poet to a T, and Poe plus T equals poet. You need this sort of want want trombone there.
Oh man.
Let me read you what that teenage girl had to say about that meeting with Poe where she got the daguerreotype. Her name was Mary Bronson, what she had to say about him. We saw Mr. Poe walking in his yard, and most agreeably was I surprised to see a very handsome and elegant appearing gentleman who welcomed us with a quiet, cordial, and graceful politeness that ill accorded with my imaginary somber poet. I dare say I looked the surprise I felt, for I saw an amused look on his face as I raised my eyes a second time. Poe proved an engaging host, at one point joking that several earlier visitors to the cottage had been disappointed to find he did not keep a pet raven perched above his doorway.
So I'm
So,
seeing the MySpace or the Facebook status update from Mary, right? And it's
mhm.
I met my favorite, emo band singer today and found out he was a normie, you know?
Right? He's like out in his yard doing yard work and sort of laughing a little bit at how he knows what she wanted and that he was just this guy and she wasn't getting what she wanted out of him.
So
Uh,
how did he feel about encounters like that? Like he wanted to be this normal guy and people want this persona from him, and did he just kind of take it in stride, or was it upsetting?
he didn't seem to mind, and this got a lot more emphatic once he was dead.
Hmm.
So, he was just sort of there living his life, and he gave a lot of autographs. A lot
Hmm.
of his letters that still survive are things like, "Here's the autograph you requested."
No.
And
A little
he seemed okay
bemused
with
by
that.
his own fame.
Hmm. And that kind of leads me into the next thing. So, yeah, he was a famous guy, and people saw that, ooh, the Raven, oh, spooky, oh, great. And he liked that. He played that up. He wasn't afraid of it, but he didn't live that in his life all the time. I mean, he had his problems, but he
Mhm.
was a regular, rounded person. What he was doing is something completely different. He was trying to change the way writing works in the world. He was one
Hmm.
of the first people who wanted to make a living on writing alone as a
Hmm.
career.
So when he was having his rivalry with Griswold, it wasn't that they were, two full-time authors, trying to outsell each other on the New York Times bestseller list.
Hmm.
It was something quite different because that idea was not a thing at that
Yes.
point.
And they were competing for jobs sort of ancillary to writing, things like editing and stuff
Mm.
like that, editing of periodicals.
Hmm.
This is sort of where Poe ended up, is writing a lot of newspapers and periodicals because of that. Writing bestsellers wasn't really a thing then, per se. I mean, that's a little bit of an exaggeration. Obviously, there were books and they were popular and they sold out.
Hmm.
However, it wasn't really expected that you were doing that to make your living.
Hmm.
Gentlemen of leisure would write edifying books about philosophy or whatever mattered to them. Think like Thomas Jefferson
Hmm.
writing about his ideals, etc. Um, novels were viewed as a little low class, it's like TV will rot your brain, that
Mm.
kind of thing. These are
Okay.
just stories. They're not important. They're not serious. Um, it's not there for a literary experience. It's there to edify. So we are starting to see that shift in this 19th century. We're seeing people like Poe's friend Charles Dickens writing as professionals, as Poe was trying
Mm.
to do. Um, we're starting to see an idea that this could be an actual career. So what do you think you need as a writer in order to make money full
Well,
time?
you need to sell the work. You got to make enough off of it to put food on the table and pay for your
Mm,
housing.
yeah, you need to sell it.
Hmm.
And if you live in a world with limited copyright law, the minute
Mm.
you publish something, there are scads of people making bootlegs and putting them out, and you can't do anything about it.
No, yeah, and you won't even know about it half the time. You can't just issue a DCMA takedown and like a YouTube or an
Yes.
Amazon ebook. Like,
And they'll
you
just
may
do it
not know
again
it's
the next
happening.
day. It's like
Yeah,
whack-a-mole.
yeah, interesting. So he's putting out content, and people are taking his content and then just making their no effort. They're just, well, not no effort, because it's not like you could just print it from a printer back then. You really have no options in defending your intellectual property at that point.
Yes, especially internationally. And like the big money was in England and in Europe. And
Hmm.
the thing is, once he printed a poem, he only got paid for it once because then everyone else was reprinting it. And it
Oh,
was
because there's
just
no royalties.
impossible.
That system was not in
Yes.
place.
And so he and Charles Dickens actually spoke about this in person. They were concerned about it, where they thought without an international agreement for copyright law, it was impossible to do this. So they were both lobbying for that. And it became,
Wow.
they were part of the beginning of the idea that copyright was important. Um,
Today I learned Edgar Allan Poe was part of the force to make copyright law a thing. I just
let me
phew.
Let me read you a passage that he wrote to his friend Frederick Thomas, sort of thinking about what really needed to happen to make literature happen in America.
Okay.
Literature is at a sad discount. There is really nothing to be done in this way. Without an international copyright law, American authors may as well cut their throats. A
Ooh.
good magazine of a true stamp would do wonders in the way of a general revivification of letters or the law. We must have both if possible. So he's saying we need two things. We need copyright law, and we need real literary journals.
Wow.
A lot of his works were printed in things kind of like Ladies' Home Journal,
Oh,
stuff like
okay.
that. Really old magazines that were around at the time, and maybe some of them are still around now. But he didn't really respect a lot of them very much. They were sort of filled with literary works, but also things like fashion plates or beauty tips, etc. And he thought, well, this pays some bills, but it's not really creating a literature. It's just sort of little diversions mixed in with other stuff. It's sort of like eking out a place for writing to
You're
be.
writing your travel blogs when all you really want to do is write your experiential novel sort of thing in
Yes.
today's equivalent.
So he
Interesting.
fought and fought and fought trying to create his own literary journal so that he could help shape sort of what the literary experience would be like in America. He wanted to call it the Stylus,
Hmm.
and he raised money and tried, and he just could not get it off the ground because he was a little ahead of his time.
Right.
And there just wasn't money in it yet.
Yeah. Interesting.
Just a little bit later, this stuff starts to happen. And I mean, even people like Griswold were deeply involved in it. They had a lot more in common than you'd think. It's kind of a shame they
So
didn't get
wait, you're
along.
telling me that Griswold got to benefit from all of the work that Poe was doing, but I'm not hearing that
Uh,
Griswold was a part of this movement here.
he did do some work towards it, though it's kind of awkward because he also was known to, like, in his own publications, to rip off other people's writing and publish it without paying them. So he kind of played the line on both sides.
Tisk, tisk, tisk.
He's not the hero of our story.
Nah.
So anyway, and he wrote about writing Poe too.
Mm.
He wrote several essays about the state of American letters. He went on a lecture tour talking about it. He wrote theory about how writing works. The poetic principle is one of them, and another is the rationale of verse.
Mm.
And, you know, as opposed to the idea of him ranting in the rain, hearing the demons give him ideas, this is what he says about writing. Most writers, poets in especial, prefer having it understood that they compose by a species of fine frenzy, an ecstatic institution, and would positively shudder at letting the public take a peep behind the scenes. They're saying people want you to think that it's inspiration, but a lot of this is perspiration. He compares it to mathematics, where you're coming up with a formula to work out how the story is going to work.
Hmm.
And it's very technical. He went into detail in that essay talking about how he wrote The Raven. And he says that it's his theory is that all writing should have one effect in mind, that writing is for an emotional experience. You're sort of taking the reader on a ride, and everything about the writing should be to produce that experience. You should have one sort of emotion, some emotional idea in mind, and everything you do is tactically designed to make that happen. He
Oh,
called it the unity
interesting.
of effect.
So in NaNoWriMo terms, National November Writing Month terms,
Mhm.
he's much less of a pantser and much more of a plotter.
Very much so. So you see how
You've
that's the
got a goal in
opposite.
mind.
And he's
Yeah.
kind of making fun of people who say they just have ecstatic intuition and just imagine things and they
Eureka.
happen. And yet that's the way he's being described. That quote from Griswold where he's ranting in the rain, it's like
Mm.
he's conversing with like his own demons in this almost mystical way. And that's where it's from. But for him, it was work.
Hmm. It's yeah, it's very much the eureka versus, sitting your butt in a chair and writing something every day and making it a habit. You can't just wait for inspiration. You've got to actually flex that writing muscle. And
Mm,
that's why it's worthy of a career, because it's not just, oh, something, came to me in a dream and I wrote it down
right.
and it was magic. It was no, I worked really hard to find the right flow of words here to really convey my goal and my intent.
I think you're tapping into just what I'm thinking of here. It's like work at every level. Writing is work in terms of
Hmm.
getting it to produce the effect you want. And it's also work worthy of respect in
Hmm.
the world.
Right.
And that's really what his passion was.
Hmm.
So, like, my point today is sort of he's not just some genius poet or troubled souls. I mean, there are those aspects to him. He was troubled, he was a genius, but he
Hmm.
also changed the world.
He
And
was
in
also
ways,
Eddie.
yeah, he was also Eddie, and he was also passionate about writing. He was passionate about
He went
other
on
people's
hikes with
writing.
dogs.
Yes, he
I'm
had
just so
ties, he
delighted
had
by that tidbit.
clothes, he loved animals. You know, he had all sorts of experiences, just like any other person, just rounded.
Hmm.
And I mean, not only was he a genius, he was also a hard worker and passionate about making the vision he had for the world happen, and it did happen.
Hmm.
He's the only American to ever invent a literary genre, detective fiction.
Oh,
It sort of
really?
shows, yes, it shows the trailblazing nature of him.
So wait, you're
He's a
saying that
precursor
James
to that.
Patterson owes everything to Poe? Please tell me that's what you're
Yes,
saying. Take that,
yes.
Patterson.
And even other things, you mentioned Lovecraft. Rod
Mm.
Serling created the Twilight
Yeah.
Zone after
Oh,
spending time on a vacation reading Poe stories and thinking
oh,
I
I
could do
marathoned
that.
the Twilight Zone last night. Oh, it was delightful.
Love him. And
Bless
very
Poe for bringing
similar,
this.
the unity of effect idea where you have a concept and you're just sort of hammering that point home quickly.
Hmm.
That's the same thing in Rod, when Rod Serling writes.
Mm.
Alfred Hitchcock said that he
Yeah.
owed his idea of suspense to Poe and that he didn't capture it as well as he wanted to. The geniuses that created our world also were inspired by Poe.
Hmm.
And not just in
Amazing.
this sort of emotional way, but in sort of how they tell stories and
Hmm.
what mediums they even have. I bet Poe would be a TV writer if he was around now.
Oh, I want that. Oh, that's
I know, right?
interesting.
Maybe we can have a
Hmm.
seance later.
Yes, I think we should definitely. There's a there's a movie that just came out where a bunch of kids do a seance through Zoom. So if they could do it, we could totally do it.
Oh, sure, literary seance. It'll be great. I have a lot of questions for the guy. Maybe he'd give us some time.
Oh, I bet if
So,
we call him Eddie and praise, his hiking with dogs,
mm.
I'm sure he'll be besties with us.
So I have one more quote, and
Hmm.
this is 8 months before he died. He'd already failed at his literary magazine. He'd already failed to make a real living work for himself. He'd already messed up everything. His fiance had already dumped him. All
Hmm.
of that. The Ultima Thule daguerreotype had been taken months beforehand, and still, this is what he has to say. Literature is the most noble of professions. In fact, it is about the only one fit for a man. For my own part, there is no seducing me from the path. I shall be a literateur, at least for all my life, nor would I abandon the hopes which still lead me on for all the gold in California.
Oh.
Hmm.
So when he passed, what was it? It was the illness that took him?
This is a whole other can of worms, and it sort of ties
Hmm.
in with the story Griswold told of him, where he's this sort of
Right.
dark, mysterious figure. Over and over and over, you will hear articles and stories and things saying Poe's death was terribly mysterious. No one knows how he died. Did he die of rabies? Was he kidnapped? Did someone try to murder him? And I think it's played up far more than makes any sense.
Well, I'm reading that quote or listening to you read that quote, and I'm going, this is a guy who intended to keep writing.
Hmm.
He was in, it sounded very much like he was intending on pulling himself up out of that dark hole that he was in and getting
Yes,
back to the work.
his passion was still there. He was traveling giving lectures when he died.
Hmm.
He died in Baltimore. He lived in New York. So he
Okay.
was traveling for work. Um, when he left the house in New York, he was living with his mother-in-law.
Hmm.
His wife had already died, but he took care of his mother-in-law. They were very close.
Oh.
And she was begging him not to leave because he was sick.
Oh.
And he left his papers in order for her because he wasn't sure if he was going to survive. But he said, well, I got to work.
Wow.
And he left. He visited a doctor friend of his who asked him to stay because he was obviously sick. He had a
Hmm.
new girlfriend at this point, and they may have been engaged. It's not really clear. It's actually
Hmm.
kind of sweet. It's the first girlfriend, his very first girlfriend he got back together
Oh.
with. This is the one who said he was a beautiful boy.
Oh.
And she was with him, and she's like, look, you look really sick. You should stay with me. Don't keep traveling. He's like, no, I got to keep working. And he left. And
Wow.
then he died in Baltimore. And I don't think that's very mysterious. I think he just was sick and died, and he was pushing himself really hard. He didn't want
Hmm.
to give up working in a way he couldn't. He had to make a living.
Right.
And this was his passion. And, people got sick and died back then.
I mean, it
It's not that
happens now.
confusing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's, I mean, because I've heard so many just crazy baseless theories, everything to, he fully intended upon the way he was gonna die, or that someone, probably and they were probably referring to Griswold, although I just didn't know it, but maybe that Griswold had murdered him or something. And it's just it's
Weird
like
stuff.
Poe versus Eddie. It really wasn't the mystery and the drama that everyone wanted it to be. It was just a man who was chronically ill, and it, it came for him.
Hmm. And he was pushing to the last to make his dream a reality. So I think
Mm.
that shows a lot of passion and strength and hope,
He
even in
loved
the
the
face of
work.
that. Yeah. So there's a lot more to him, and
Mm.
I'm happy to be able to share that.
It's not scary death, murder, and putting hearts under the floorboard. It's love. Poe, it was,
Sure.
it maybe had a darker goth aesthetic, but he was still writing about love, and that
Mm,
girl Mary was right on that. It was, he was trying to be a romantic, or he was just by nature.
yes, dark romanticism is the way we put it sometimes.
Yeah.
And so just in the future, when you read it, look for his humor, look
Mm.
for the passion for writing there, how the structure is designed to give you a certain feeling. All of it is carefully laid out. Enjoy the full experience of Poe.
Mm. Well, and on that note, so we only have two, but I pulled them out. So the library has The Fall of the House of Usher and Other Writings,
Mm.
and we also have a works of Poe in a kind of nondescript book. But these are available for patrons to check out during curbside service. You can send us an email and say, hey, give me the Poe books, or you could go to the catalog and just search for Poe and put a hold on him. And if
Mm.
we're interested in maybe getting more of his collections, you can always send requests to us. I would be delighted to put in the request on your behalf for anything Poe. That would make me just deliriously happy. Whether it's movie adaptations or more of his actual writings, I would be totally interested to see if I would be able to get some of his more not his fiction works, but if any of his other kinds of writing are available, that would
Right.
be interesting to see too. So
Yeah, there
yeah,
are books
so
of essays you can get.
oh, fabulous. I love it. So please
Right.
request that.
And you guys are lucky to have Chaslin, so get in touch with her. What you're passionate about, she will hook you up.
Absolutely. Yeah, the reason that you and I have connected is through stories. And
Mm.
I intensely believe that stories make an impact. It explains to us who we are and who other people are and how we relate to the world. And, whether that's from, talking about amazing literary genius Edgar Allan Poe, or whether that's us analyzing episodes of The Walking Dead before that show became an utter disappointment, you know,
Mm.
talking about why such a character is actually way more fascinating than anyone else gave them credit for before that character became the main character of the show 8 years later. Let it be said here and now that Jeanette called that Carol Peltier was the best character on the show long before she actually
Ah,
was recognized as the best character on the show. And even though neither of us watches that show anymore, we were
right.
right and you were wrong. Nah.
Well, and there's things that we also love, like Twin Peaks and Twilight
Yes.
Zone and Alfred
Okay.
Hitchcock.
I'm
There's
gonna
just
have you
good
come back
stuff.
and talk about Twin Peaks because oh gosh, there's so many thoughts. And the fun thing is that
Mm.
you and I don't always agree on Twin Peaks, which is
Oh,
amazing. So like I pretty much agree with like 99.9% of what you say about Twin Peaks.
oh
But there are
boy.
some things where I'm like, I don't know about it. And maybe it's just because of my own confusion on the series. But like one of my things that I did when I started working here was I said we got to get the whole Twin Peaks DVD series. So I got us, seasons 1 and 2, Fire Walk with Me, The Return. We got Laura Palmer's Diary. We got
Mm.
the Secret History of Twin Peaks and the final dossier, which you definitely had thoughts about, and I know you did. And I had some definite complaints too, and it only got worse from there. I think the only thing I don't have is Coop's autobiography tapes, the book of that. So I was
Nice.
definitely working on turning this place into like a Twin Peaks library. So
Well, it's
maybe one
all
of
about what
our
you're passionate about.
so maybe one of our next we're switching the name from Geek Group to Coffee Chat, and maybe one of our next coffee chats we'll get some double R diner coffee in us and drink that. Maybe you get a slice of cherry pie and talk Twin Peaks.
Well, that would be fun.
Yes. Thank you so much, Jeanette, for
All
talking to
right.
me about
Thank
your
you for
dead
having
boyfriend.
me. It was a fun time.
If anyone ever has any questions about Poe, like if you just want to learn stuff, I can always forward your questions on to Jeanette too.
I'd
Just
be
because
happy to answer them.
she's spent so many years, studying this man and his life and his works that if you feel like, hey, I want to know about this and him and Griswold or whatever, just let me know. I'll forward those questions. Maybe we could do a part 2 of Poe some point, maybe next year for October, or maybe in a couple of months we could do another part of Poe. But yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed this. My mind was blown several times. So
Well, it's a
thank you.
pleasure. All right.